Welcome, history lovers, to our channel. Today we uncover the tragic end of a teenage king. A dark, freezing trench in Norway. A stray bullet shatters a young king's skull, wiping out a mighty empire. But who was this fallen monarch? Charles XII of Sweden, a teenage boy who became a god of war. At 15, he gained a massive army. Greedy neighbors thought him weak, striking from all directions. Yet, instead of begging for peace, he quickly drew his sword. He crushed his foes, but his dark obsession doomed his nation. In the late 17th century, the Swedish Empire ruled the Baltic Sea with absolute power. Majestic Baroque castles stood tall along the coast, showcasing wealth, dominance, and endless glory. In 1697, the old king died. He left the heavy crown to his young son, Charles XII. At just 15 years old, Charles stepped into the grand throne room, draped in velvet and rare ermine fur. The royal court watched in silence. Could this innocent pale boy command a fierce and massive empire? He refused to let anyone crown him. Instead, the arrogant prince placed the heavy crown on his own head. Across the dark borders, hungry wolves watched. Three major powers saw a golden chance to steal his lands. Peter the Great, a towering giant, desired a warm water port for his growing naval fleet. The King of Denmark wanted his lost lands back. He hated the Swedish dominance over the cold seas. Meanwhile, Augustus II of Poland dreamed of crushing Swedish trade and seizing coastal wealth. In hidden candlelit rooms, these three monarchs smiled wickedly and signed a secret, dark alliance. Historical records state they planned a sudden, massive strike, thinking the teenage king would easily break. They tore up ancient peace treaties without warning, moving huge armies toward the Swedish borders at night. The northern winds howled as Danish troops marched boldly into the allied lands of the Swedish young king. Polish forces besieged Riga, while Peter the Great marched 40,000 Russian soldiers toward Narva. The Swedish council panicked. Messengers rushed into the palace, shouting about the massive invasion. Nobles begged the young king to surrender, to sign a peace deal and save their beautiful coastal cities. Charles sat on his throne, his icy blue eyes fixed on the map. He did not show a single drop of fear. He stood up slowly, looking at his terrified advisors. He swore to never start an unjust war. But he also swore to never end a rightful war until all his greedy enemies were destroyed. The boy king stripped off his velvet cape. He put on the simple, rough blue wool coat of a common soldier. He strapped a cavalry sword to his hip, leaving behind the luxurious palace life and his soft youth. The famous Carolean army, a disciplined war machine, gathered under his bright yellow banners. They wore striking blue uniforms and carried heavy flintlock muskets. They were trained to fight to the death. Young Charles marched his men to the sea. He planned to strike Denmark first, moving with terrifying speed. Under the cover of darkness, the Swedish fleet crossed the waters, landing right outside the capital. The Danish king was deeply shocked. He never expected the teenager to attack with such brutal force. Charles waded through the cold waves, leading the charge himself. Bullets splashed violently in the water. Hearing the musket fire, Charles smiled. He called it the sweetest music he had ever heard in his life. Denmark surrendered instantly. The first head of the enemy Hydra was cleanly severed by the boy. Now the young king turned his furious gaze towards the east. The giant Russian army was waiting at Narva. By late 1700, Peter the Great had surrounded the fortress of Narva with deep trenches. 40,000 Russian soldiers camped in the freezing mud, confident that the small fortress would fall soon. Charles arrived with only 10,000 tired, freezing men. The odds were heavily stacked against the Swedes. "Would you dare to attack an army 4 times your size in the middle of a deadly, blinding winter storm?" Charles did not hesitate. A massive blizzard blew directly into the faces of the Russian troops. He ordered his men to advance under the cover of the white snow. The Caroleans marched in silence. They used the famous go-on tactic. They marched straight into enemy fire without ever shooting back. They waited until they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. Then they fired a devastating volley. Drawing their swords, the Swedes charged into the Russian lines like a pack of starving, ferocious wolves. The Russian ranks broke in sheer panic. Thousands fled into the freezing river, drowning in the icy depth. Charles fought in the thickest mud. His horse was shot, but he simply grabbed another and kept fighting. Peter the Great had fled the battlefield. His grand army was utterly crushed by a young teenager. The victory at Narva shocked the entire world. The boy king was now feared as a living god of war. Europe called him the Alexander of the North. He slept in the snow and ate dry bread with his loyal men. Next, Charles aimed his fierce wrath directly at Poland. He chased King Augustus through swamps and dense, dark forests. For 6 long years, the Swedish army dominated Eastern Europe, winning many brutal battles. Charles easily dethroned the Polish king, placing his own loyal puppet on the grand throne in Warsaw. He was unbeatable. His presence on the battlefield made enemy soldiers drop their weapons and run. But deep inside his mind, a dark seed of arrogance began to grow. War became his only true passion. Diplomats begged him to sign peace treaties. They offered him vast lands, immense wealth, and great glory. Yet Charles refused every single offer. He believed God chose him to erase his enemies. He wanted to march straight to Moscow, to drag Peter the Great from his throne and burn down the city. Modern scholars argue this stubbornness was his fatal flaw, blinding him to the limits of his men. In 1707, Charles led 40,000 veterans eastward, stepping into a fatal trap. Peter the Great had learned from his bitter defeat. He rebuilt his army, modernizing all his cannons. The Russian Tsar refused to fight head-on. He used the scorched earth tactic, burning his own towns and crops. As the Swedes marched deeper into Russia, they found nothing but black ash, poisoned wells, and dead cattle. Hunger began to kill the invincible Caroleans. Their supply lines were stretched far too thin to work. Then came the winter of 1708. It was the most brutal winter Europe had ever seen. Birds froze in midair and dropped dead. Wine turned into solid ice blocks inside the officers' dark tents. Thousands of Swedish soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Their blue uniforms turned into icy, torn rags. Charles watched his men suffer, but his pride pushed him blindly forward into the frozen Russian wasteland. By the spring of 1709, the mighty Swedish army was reduced to a starving shadow. They desperately besieged the Russian fort of Poltava, hoping to find badly needed supplies. During a night patrol, disaster struck. A stray bullet hit Charles straight in the foot, shattering the bone. The wound became badly infected. The king burned with fever, unable to walk or ride his war horse. For the first time, the god of war was strapped to a wooden stretcher, completely helpless and in deep pain. Peter the Great finally saw his golden chance. He marched an 80,000-strong army to crush the Swedes. The Russians built heavy redoubts, blocking the Swedish path with a wall of massive, deadly bronze cannons. On a foggy morning, the wounded Charles ordered his tired men to attack the fortified Russian line. The Caroleans charged bravely, but they lacked powder and artillery to break the strong defenses. Russian cannons ripped through the blue uniforms. Crimson stained the green grass and the muddy battleground. The Swedish infantry was completely vanquished. Their discipline could not save them from the heavy fire. Imagine watching your loyal friends being struck down while you lie wounded and helpless on a stretcher. Charles tried to command from his litter, but a cannonball smashed the stretcher, throwing him to the ground. His loyal guards bravely shielded his broken body, fighting hard to carry their fallen king to safety. Peter the Great rode tall on his massive horse, watching the legendary Swedish army being wiped out. The Russian Tsar had conquered his greatest nightmare, cementing his legacy as a brilliant ruler. The Battle of Poltava was a catastrophe. Thousands of veteran Swedish troops were fully lost. Many were sent to the freezing gulags of Siberia, never to see their Nordic homeland again. Charles barely escaped the carnage. With a handful of guards, he fled south across the dangerous rivers. He crossed into the Ottoman Empire, seeking refuge from the Russian cavalry and the bitter cold. The great conqueror was now a desperate exile, living in a foreign camp, far from his throne. Yet even in defeat, his stubbornness remained intact. He refused to admit that his empire was lost. He spent 5 long years in the Ottoman lands, constantly plotting to drag the Sultan into a new war. He lived in complete denial, sending absurd orders back to Sweden as if he still controlled the world. Meanwhile, the Dark Alliance attacked Sweden again, tearing away its coastal provinces and ports. The plague ravaged the Swedish capital. The empire was bleeding to death, badly needing its king back. The Ottoman hosts grew tired of his arrogant demands. They finally attacked his camp to force him out. In a bizarre skirmish called the Kalabalik, Charles fought fiercely with a sword against hundreds of guards. Finally captured, he was politely told to leave. The god of war had become an aging, bitter man. In 1714, Charles disguised himself and rode across Europe in just 15 exhausting, dark days. He finally reached Swedish lands, but the magnificent empire he once knew was nothing but crumbling ash. The tragic cycle was nearly complete, but the stubborn king still had one final deadly move left to play. Upon returning, Charles refused to seek a peaceful end. He wanted to rebuild his broken army. But the Swedish lands were completely empty. Only old men, young boys, and grieving widows were left behind. Still, the stubborn monarch forced a massive draft. He squeezed every last drop of hope from his dying nation. He planned to conquer Norway, to use it as a bargaining chip against his Russian and Danish foes. In late 1718, an army of young teenagers marched blindly into the deep Norwegian snow. They besieged the strong Fredriksten fortress. The freezing, muddy trenches were a total living hell. Soldiers carved through solid rock and freezing mud. Enemy cannons fired constantly from the high stone walls. Charles was now 36 years old. His face was deeply scarred, heavily wrinkled, and constantly tired. He no longer looked like the radiant boy king. He was a dark, tragic figure, wrapped in a filthy trench coat. Despite the extreme danger, Charles walked the front lines, totally ignoring the deadly flying bullets. He believed that fate alone would decide his death. He refused to duck when the enemy snipers opened fire. On the night of November 30th, the dark sky was lit up by constant, bright artillery flashes. Charles climbed up the muddy trench wall to inspect the digging progress, exposing his head to the fortress. He rested his chin on his gloved hands, peering through the thick darkness at the towering enemy walls. Suddenly, a single shot rang out through the freezing night. It was a perfectly aimed and fatal strike. A heavy bullet smashed into the left side of his skull, exiting through his right temple in a sudden flash. The king collapsed instantly onto the muddy trench wall. His right hand instinctively grabbed his sword hilt. But it was too late. Charles XII, the great god of war, was dead before his body even hit the cold mud. To this day, the source of that fatal bullet remains a highly debated historical mystery. Did it come from a Danish sniper, or was he assassinated by his own mutinous Swedish troops? Many historians suspect enemy fire, but the legend of a traitor's bullet strongly survives. The news of his sudden death spread through the frozen trenches like a massive, deeply devastating shockwave. Without their fierce king, the Swedish forces lost their will to fight. They immediately broke the long siege. They carried his lifeless body across the snowy mountains, leaving thousands of dead soldiers behind them. A brutal blizzard struck during their retreat, freezing thousands more in the tragic Carolean death march. With Charles dead and the army destroyed, the Swedish Empire collapsed, never recovering its glory. Led by Peter the Great, Russia rose from the ashes to become the true master of Eastern Europe. Charles XII was a military genius, possessing unmatched courage and an ironclad will. Yet his refusal to compromise and his blinding arrogance turned his greatest victories into dust. He was a shining meteor lighting up the European sky, only to burn out far too quickly. His legacy is a tragic reminder that absolute power and pride will always lead to ruin. The teenage god of war finally became the architect of his own nation's total destruction. Did Charles XII fight to protect his realm, or was he a madman leading his men to a frozen death? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Was he a brilliant hero or a tyrant ruining his land? If you enjoyed this journey, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more epic history tales.